Why I Wrote the Crucible, An Artist's Answer to Politics by Arthur Miller. As I watched The Crucible taking shape as a movie over the past year, the sheer depth of time that it represents for me kept returning to mind. As those powerful actors blossomed on the screen, and the children and the horses, the crowds and the wagons, I thought again about how I came to cook all this up nearly 50 years ago. And in America, almost no one I know seems to remember clearly. In a way, there is a biting irony in this film's having been made by a Hollywood studio, something unimaginable in the 50s. But there they are, Daniel Day-Lewis, John Proctor, seething his seaboarded field, Joan Allen, Elizabeth, lying pregnant in the frigid jail, Winona Ryder, Abigail, stealing her minister uncle's money, majestic Paul Schofield, Judge Danforth, and his righteous empathy with the devil-possessed children, and all of them looking as inevitable as rain. The Crucible was an act of desperation. Much of my desperation branched out, I suppose, from the typical Depression-era trauma. The blow on the mind by the rise of European fascism and the brutal anti-Semitism it had brought to power. But by 1950, when I began to think of writing about the hunt for Reds in America, I was motivated in some great part by the paralysis that had set in among many liberals who, despite their discomfort with the Inquisitors' violations of civil rights, were fearful, with good reason, of being identified as covert communists if they should protest too strongly. The Red Hunt, led by the House Committee on Un-American Activities and by McCarthy, was becoming the dominating fixation of the American psyche. It reached Hollywood when the studios, after first resisting, agreed to submit artists' names to the House Committee for clearing before employing them. This unleashed a veritable holy terror among actors, directors, and others, from party members to those who had the merest brush with the front organization. So many practices of the Salem witch trials were similar to those employed by the congressional committees that I could easily be accused of skewing history for a mere partisan purpose. Inevitably, it was no sooner known that my new play was about Salem than I had to confront the charge that such an analogy was specious. That there never were any witches, but there certainly are communists. In the 17th century, however, the existence of witches was never questioned by the loftiest minds in Europe and America, and even lawyers of the highest eminence believed that witches had to be prosecuted mercilessly. Of course, there were no communists in 1692, but it was literally worth your life to deny witches or their powers, given the exhortation in the Bible. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. There had to be witches in the world, or the Bible lied. Indeed, the very structure of evil depended on Lucifer's plotting against God. Naturally, the best proof of the sincerity of your confession was naming others whom you had seen in the devil company, an invitation to private vengeance, but made official by the seal of the theocratic state. It was as though the court had grown tired of thinking and had invited in the instincts, spectral evidence, that poisoned cloud of paranoid fantasy made a kind of lunatic sense to them, as it did in plot-ridden 1952. So when the question was not the acts of an accused, but the thoughts and intentions in his alienated mind. The breathtaking circularity of the process had a kind of poetic tightness. Not everybody was accused after all, so there must be some reason why you were. By denying that there is any reason whatsoever for you to be accused, you are implying, by virtue of a surprisingly small logical leap, that mere chance picked you out, which in turn implies that the devil might not really be at work in the village, or, God forbid, even exist. Therefore, the investigation itself is either mistaken or a fraud. And you would have to be a crypto-Luciferian to say that. Not a great idea if you wanted to go back to your farm. The more I read into the Salem Panic, the more it touched off corresponding ages of common experiences in the 50s. The old friend of a blacklisted person crossing the street to avoid being seen talking to him. the overnight conversations of former leftists into born again patriots, and so on. Apparently, processes are universal. When Gentiles in Hitler's Germany, for example, saw their Jewish neighbors being trucked off, or in Soviet Ukraine saw the kulaks sing before their eyes, the common reaction, even among those unsympathetic to Nazism or communism, was quite naturally to turn away in fear for being identified with the condemned. As I learned from non-Jewish refugees, however, there was often a despairing pity mixed with them. Well, they must have done something. Few of us can easily surrender our belief that society must somehow make sense. The thought that the state had lost its mind and is punishing so many innocent people is intolerable, and so the evidence has to be internally denied. On opening night in January 22nd, 1953, I knew that the atmosphere would be pretty hostile. The coldness of the crowd was not a surprise. Broadway audiences were not famous for loving history lessons, which is what they made of the play. It seems to me entirely appropriate that on the day the play opened, a newspaper headline read, "All 13 Reds Guilty," a story about American communists who faced prison for conspiring to teach and advocate the duty and necessity of forcible overthrow of the government. About a year later, a new production, one with younger, less accomplished actors working in the Martinique Hotel Ballroom, played with the fervor that the script and times required, and The Crucible became a hit. The play stumbled into history, and today, I am told, it is one of the most heavily demanded trade fiction paperbacks in this country. The Bantam and Penguin editions have sold more than 6 million copies. I don't think there has ever been a week in the past 40-odd years when it hasn't been on a stage somewhere in the world. Nor is the new screen version the first. I am not sure what The Crucible is telling people now, but I know that its paranoid center is still pumping out the same darkly attractive warning that it did in the 50s. For some, the play seems to be about the dilemma of relying on testimony of small children accusing adults of sexual abuse, something I'd not dreamed of 40 years ago. For others, it may simply be a fascination with the outbreak of paranoia that suffices the play, the blind panic that, in our age, often seems to sit at the dim edges of consciousness. Certainly, its political implications are the central issue for many people. The Salem interrogations turn out to be eerily exact models of those yet to come in Stalin's Russia, Pinochet's Chile, Mao's China, and other regimes. But below its concerns with justice, the play evokes a lethal brew of illicit sexuality, fear of the supernatural, and political manipulation, a combination not unfamiliar these days. The film, by reaching the broad American audience, as no play ever can, may well unearth still other connections to those buried public terrors that Salem first announced on this continent.